When your own child looks you in the eye and says you're no longer capable of making decisions, the world doesn't just break, it shatters. That was the day I realized love can turn into the most polite kind of betrayal. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us keep telling stories like this. And tell me in the comments where you're listening to this story of betrayal and courage from. I'd love to know. When I called my son Daniel that morning, I expected a simple conversation. Something about wedding plans, maybe the date, or what color tie he had chosen. Instead, a stranger's voice answered the phone, smooth and polite, but with an edge I couldn't quite name. It was Sophie, his fiancée. "Oh, Mrs. Hayes," she said cheerfully. "You didn't hear? We got married yesterday. It was very intimate. We only invited close people." For a second, I thought I had misheard. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, choking everything familiar. Only close people. I felt my hand go cold around the receiver. The air in the room thickened. Behind me, the morning light from the kitchen window struck the glass cabinet where I kept the wedding gift I'd been saving for them, a delicate crystal bowl engraved with their names. I had imagined giving it to them after the ceremony, wrapped in silver paper. Now, it looked like a relic from another life. Only close people. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My son had always been a kind boy, the type to help me carry groceries, to kiss my cheek before heading out. When had he become the man who could erase his own mother from the most important day of his life? I pressed the phone closer to my ear, half hoping Sophie would laugh and say it was a joke. Instead, her tone softened into something pitying. "Don't take it personally, Mrs. Hayes. It was small, just family." Family. The irony struck me like a punch. For 3 years, I had been their safety net, the silent force behind their dreams. Every month, I paid their $550 rent. I filled their fridge when Daniel's commissions ran slow, covered Sophie's dentist bill when she cracked a tooth, and even helped with the down payment on the furniture they now sat on, probably celebrating their secret vows. And yet, in that crucial moment, I wasn't family. I was financing family. The lavender dress I had bought for the wedding still hung in the closet, untouched, next to the shoes I'd spent hours choosing. I'd imagined walking down the church aisle with Daniel, proud and trembling, maybe wiping a tear when he said, "Mom, this wouldn't have been possible without you." But instead, there was nothing. Just a void filled with laughter I wasn't part of, photos I would never see, a life that had no space left for me. I stayed in that silence for a long time, hearing only the faint tick of the kitchen clock. My heart beat unevenly, like it couldn't decide whether to break or to keep fighting. I replayed every sacrifice, every little moment I had brushed aside as what mothers do. The 2 jobs after my husband died. The years of saving, of denying myself vacations, new clothes, small comforts, all so Daniel could build a better life. And now that he had it, I was the disposable chapter, the forgotten prologue. It's strange how betrayal doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes disguised as a smile through the telephone, in words spoken too softly to sound cruel. Only close people. That phrase didn't just hurt, it awakened something that had been buried for decades. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of them laughing, posing for pictures, cutting cake while I sat alone, played in my head on a cruel loop. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, staring at the quiet street outside. The moonlight fell across my kitchen table, the same table where I had planned the wedding menu, where I had written checks for their rent, where I had once imagined family dinners. I walked to the closet, opened it, and looked at the lavender dress. My hands touched the fabric. It was smooth, still carrying the scent of the store where I'd bought it. I had chosen that color because Sophie once said it reminded her of calm. How fitting, I thought bitterly. That calm was exactly what she wanted now, a quiet mother who asked no questions, who gave endlessly and expected nothing. The next morning, I tried to call Daniel again, just once, to hear his voice. The call went straight to voicemail. That was the moment I understood it wasn't an accident. They hadn't forgotten me. They had excluded me. Intentionally. Purposefully. The realization didn't bring tears this time. It brought clarity. I walked to my desk and opened a drawer that had been neglected for too long. Bank statements, receipts, transfer slips. Each one was a testimony of my love disguised as duty. I ran my fingers over the totals. Thousands of dollars poured into a life that no longer included me. How do you put a price on motherhood? You can't, but apparently they could. When the sun rose that morning, I stood at the mirror and truly looked at myself for the first time in years. A 72-year-old widow with lines carved by sacrifice, eyes dulled by giving too much. But beneath the exhaustion, I saw something else, a spark, small but undeniable. The woman staring back wasn't weak. She was waking up. That day, I made a decision that would change everything. If I wasn't close enough to be invited to their happiness, I was done paying for it. And if being a mother meant surrendering my dignity, then I would rather be alone than invisible. For the first time in my life, I chose myself. Before the story continues, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here. If you find this story meaningful so far, please consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us grow and gives us the motivation to keep sharing more powerful stories like this one. Your support truly makes a difference. Now, let me ask you something to think about before we move on. If someone you loved deeply excluded you from their wedding but kept asking for your financial help afterward, what would you do? A. Forgive and keep helping, hoping they'll realize their mistake. B. Stop the help immediately and protect your peace. Type your answer A or B in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to see how many of you would make the same choice I did. The call from Sophie had ended, but its echo followed me like a ghost. For days I drifted through the house in a fog, touching things that no longer meant what they used to. The lavender dress in the closet. The envelope of money I'd set aside for their wedding gift, $1,000 saved from skipping dinners out. New shoes, small luxuries. Even the silver-framed photo of Daniel at graduation seemed to mock me now. I had thought I was building his future. In truth, I had been funding my own disappearance from it. A week later, my phone rang again, the same number I had sworn never to answer. I almost ignored it, but habit the old reflex of a mother who always picks up one. Eleanor? Sophie's voice trembled. The landlord says we have to pay this week. The rent is 2 months behind. You forgot the transfer. Forgot. The word struck deep, not because it was cruel, but because it was so ordinary. She said it the same way one might say, I forgot the milk, or I forgot to lock the door. As if my monthly sacrifice was a routine task she had every right to expect. I heard Daniel's voice faintly in the background, low and tense, whispering instructions. For a long moment, I said nothing. The silence stretched, and I could hear Sophie breathing on the line, waiting for me to rush to their rescue as I always had. I remembered the first time I helped them, the excitement in Daniel's voice when he told me they'd found an apartment but needed a little help with the deposit. Just this once, Mom, he'd said. But just once had turned into years. I remembered how I'd packed groceries in my own kitchen beans, rice, soup cans, and driven across town to fill their empty cupboards while mine grew bare. I had called it love, but it was servitude disguised as devotion. Didn't I tell you, I finally said, my voice calm, even measured, that I only help close people. There was a pause so long I could almost feel it bending time, then a small, confused laugh. What? Eleanor, I don't understand. Yes, you do, I replied, and hung up. The quiet afterward was strange, sharp, electric. I could hear the refrigerator hum, the ticking of the old clock above the sink. It was as though the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I walked to the table and sat down, hands folded, staring at the phone. My heart was pounding, but I realized it wasn't fear. It was release. For the first time in years, I had said no. That evening, I poured myself a cup of tea and opened a worn notebook where I kept bills and notes. I began writing down numbers. Rent, $550 a month for 3 years. Groceries and supplies, about $200 each month. Birthdays, holidays, emergencies, another few thousand at least. By the time I finished, the total came to nearly $33,000. $33,000. I had worked 40 years as a teacher, saving carefully for retirement. That money was supposed to buy me peace. Instead, it had purchased silence, theirs and mine. I sat there staring at the sum, and something inside me shifted. Love should be about presence, not payment. But I had turned motherhood into a transaction, afraid that if I stopped paying, the connection would break. The truth was harsher. The connection had been broken long before I realized it. The next morning, I woke before dawn and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. My reflection looked older than I remembered, creases around my mouth, the faint sag beneath my chin, but the eyes were steady. I thought of my late husband, Robert, and the promise I had made to him on the night he died, that I would take care of Daniel. I had kept that promise long after it stopped making sense. Maybe now it was time to keep another promise, the one I'd quietly made to myself years earlier when Robert was gone and the loneliness crept in. I had sworn that I would never let anyone, not even family, make me feel small again. That day, I didn't wait for the next call. I dressed carefully, a pale blue sweater and dark slacks, tied my hair back, and drove to the bank. The air inside smelled faintly of disinfectant and printer ink. Behind the counter, Mr. Lawrence, the branch manager, smiled when he saw me. "Mrs. Hayes, the usual transfer today?" "Not today," I said. "I need to cancel them, all of them." He blinked. "All of them?" "Yes, and I want to make sure my accounts are secure. No one should have access but me." He nodded slowly, perhaps sensing that this was not a whim but a declaration. "Are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure." While he typed, I looked out the glass window toward the parking lot. The winter sunlight reflected off the cars, and for a moment I imagined Daniel's old red truck pulling in, his familiar wave, his voice calling, "Hey, Mom." But it was just memory. One that belonged to another life. When the paperwork was done, Mr. Lawrence handed me the forms. "You've always been generous, Mrs. Hayes. I hope no one's pressuring you to make this change." I smiled faintly. No one's pressuring me anymore. I walked out of the bank with my head high. The cold air bit my cheeks, but it felt clean, almost cleansing. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, my heart felt unburdened. The money I had just reclaimed wasn't just currency, it was time, respect, and freedom. That afternoon, the phone rang again. I didn't answer. It rang a second time, then a third. Finally, I turned it off altogether. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. It was mine. Later, as dusk fell, I sat by the window and watched the neighborhood lights flicker on one by one. I thought of the years I had wasted, the dinners I'd skipped, the dreams I had postponed for their comfort. But I didn't feel regret. I felt something new, something almost like pride. Because saying no, after a lifetime of yes, is its own kind of victory. For the first time, I understood that love given out of guilt isn't love at all. It's fear wearing a gentle face, and I had no fear left to give. That night, before bed, I whispered into the darkness, "It's over." The words hung in the air, soft but solid. They were my prayer, my goodbye, and my beginning all at once. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll start something new. I didn't yet know what that would be, only that it would belong to me. That night I didn't sleep. My mind was too awake, too alive with questions I had avoided for years. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the hallway clock. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen in hand, staring at a blank sheet of paper. For so long, I had avoided looking at numbers, not because I didn't understand them, but because they would have forced me to face an uncomfortable truth that love had cost me everything I was supposed to have saved for myself. I began to write. Slowly at first, as if each number carried the weight of a confession. Rent $550 a month, 36 months, $19,800. Groceries $200 a month, $7,200. Birthdays, Christmases, anniversaries $3,500. Unexpected emergencies. Sophie's root canal, Daniel's broken transmission, the leak in their bathroom I paid to fix, all of it down to the cent. $32,900. I stared at the total, feeling an almost physical ache in my chest. $32,900, the sum of my guilt, my silence, my need to be needed. That money had been my safety net, the cushion I was supposed to rely on if I ever became ill, if the roof started leaking, if life took one of its unpredictable turns. But instead, I had handed it away piece by piece, convincing myself each time that it was temporary, that Daniel would find his footing and repay me not with money but with gratitude. He never did. Numbers have a way of stripping illusions bare. Looking at them in black ink, I saw years of small betrayals that I had accepted as normal. Each transfer was a way of buying peace. Each payment was an apology I didn't owe. What hurt the most wasn't the loss of money. It was the realization that every dollar I'd sent had deepened a debt that could never be repaid. Not financially, not emotionally. I got up and walked through the house, the one Robert and I had built together. Every corner of it carried our history, the framed photos in the hallway, the grooves on the dining table where he used to rest his elbows as he read the paper. When he passed away, I thought my purpose was to hold everything together, to give Daniel the kind of stability I had lost. But I hadn't noticed that in trying to preserve the family, I had become its foundation, buried and unseen, holding up the weight of others. The next morning, I made coffee and carried my notebook to the porch. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pale pink. I looked at the total again, but this time I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. I had always believed motherhood meant sacrifice without boundaries, that giving endlessly was proof of love. But now I saw how mistaken that was. Love without limits isn't noble, it's self-erasure. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "No more." It wasn't defiance, it was survival. As I sipped my coffee, I began to think about the years I had spent as a teacher. I used to tell my students that the hardest part of growing up wasn't learning facts, but learning how to stand up for what was right. Now, sitting there, in my own quiet rebellion, I realized that lesson was still waiting for me to learn. Age doesn't make us wise by itself, it only gives us time. Wisdom comes when we finally decide to use it. I went back inside and opened the cabinet where I kept old envelopes and stationery. Inside was a letter Robert had written to me on our 20th anniversary. I had read it hundreds of times before, but this time one line stood out. "Promise me, Ellie, you'll live for yourself someday." I pressed the letter against my heart and whispered, "I'm trying." After breakfast, I began cleaning the house, not out of routine, but out of ritual. I wanted to reclaim my space. The living room, where Daniel and Sophie had often sprawled across my couch, complaining about bills. The kitchen, where I'd cooked for them even when my joints ached. Every sweep of the broom felt like erasing a footprint that had lingered too long. By afternoon, the house smelled of lemon polish and fresh air. I stood by the window, looking at my reflection faintly mirrored in the glass. The woman staring back at me was not the same one who had picked up the phone weeks ago, trembling at the sound of her son's voice. This woman had lines of fatigue, yes, but also lines of strength. I realized that what I'd been mourning wasn't Daniel's betrayal, it was my own blindness. It was almost 3 when the phone buzzed again. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. I let it ring until it stopped. Then I took the phone and set it face down on the table. There was something liberating about the silence that followed. That evening, I sat with the notebook once more, but this time I wrote something different. I listed everything I had given up, not in money but in years. Vacations I never took, books I never bought. Friends I lost touch with because Daniel might need me. I added it all up, not in numbers but in memories, and realized I had been living a life half-lived, waiting for someone else's approval to make it whole. The total of that, I thought, was far greater than $32,000. It was decades of stolen peace. And then, almost without meaning to, I began to imagine what it would be like to reclaim it. I pictured myself traveling, painting, maybe joining the book club at the library I'd always meant to visit. I imagined sitting in a cafe alone, reading the morning paper without feeling guilty. Freedom, I realized, doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly, like the first breeze of spring after a long winter, whispering, "You've done enough, now live." When night came, I closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and went to bed. For the first time in years, I didn't pray for Daniel's happiness. I prayed for my own. And as I drifted off to sleep, one truth settled deep inside me. No amount of giving will ever fill the heart of someone who sees you only as a source. The only way to stop being used is to stop volunteering for it. Tomorrow, I decided, I would take the next step. It was time to face the world not as the mother who gave too much, but as the woman who finally remembered her own worth. The morning after my long reckoning with numbers, I woke with a strange calm that felt foreign, almost suspicious. For the first time in months, my thoughts weren't crowded by Daniel and Sophie's problems. The sky outside was gray, the kind of color that usually made me stay in bed longer, but that morning I got up with purpose. I showered, brushed my hair, and put on my navy coat, the one Robert used to say made me look unshakable. I didn't know where that strength had gone all these years, but I hoped I could find a trace of it again. At 9 sharp I drove to the bank. It was the same building I had visited every month for 3 years to send Daniel and Sophie their rent. I could almost feel the muscle memory in my hands, the way they'd automatically sign the transfer slip without thinking. But this time was different. As I walked through the glass doors, the air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. It reminded me of order, of structure, of the world of logic that had nothing to do with guilt or affection. Behind the counter, Mr. Lawrence looked up from his computer and smiled warmly. "Mrs. Hayes, it's been a while. I was just about to process your usual transfers, right on time, as always." "Not today," I said softly but firmly. He blinked, puzzled. "Oh? Would you like to change the amount?" "No, Mr. Lawrence. I'd like to cancel them. All of them." The words surprised even me. Saying them out loud felt like unlocking a door I hadn't realized I'd been standing behind for years. He removed his glasses and studied my face for a moment, as though making sure I understood what I was saying. "Cancel? You mean permanently?" "Yes, permanently." He hesitated, kind but careful. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Hayes? I hope no one's pressuring you." For a fleeting moment, his question hurt because I knew the answer was yes, though not in the way he meant. I smiled faintly. "No one is pressuring me anymore, Mr. Lawrence. I just realized it's time I start looking after myself." He nodded slowly, and his expression softened with understanding. "It's never too late to do that," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he turned to his keyboard, his fingers tapping swiftly as he canceled the automatic transfers that had drained my account, month after month, year after year. As he printed the confirmation papers, I looked around the room. I saw younger couples opening joint accounts, students depositing their first checks, retirees chatting about vacations. Everyone here seemed to have some kind of plan except me. For years, my plan had been to help Daniel and Sophie, to make sure they never struggled the way Robert and I once did. But in doing so, I had forgotten that survival isn't the same thing as living. When Mr. Lawrence handed me the forms, he said, "You've always been one of our most generous clients, Mrs. Hayes. I'm glad you're thinking about your own future now." His words touched me more than I expected. They carried no judgment, no pity, only respect, something I hadn't felt from my own family in a long time. "Thank you," I said, signing the papers with steady hands. Once the last signature was done, I felt a strange lightness. It was as though a weight I'd carried so long had become part of my posture, and suddenly it was gone. I placed the pen down slowly, almost ceremoniously. As I stepped out of the bank, the winter air hit my face, crisp and clean. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply. The noise of traffic, the rush of strangers walking by, it all sounded sharper, more vivid, as if the world had come back into focus. For 3 years, I had lived in a haze of obligation, moving from one payment to the next. Now the haze had lifted. My life was mine again, in the simplest, most practical sense. When I got back to my car, I saw that my phone had rung 5 times, Daniel's name flashing across the screen, then Sophie's. I didn't answer. I knew what they wanted to say. They'd probably already called the landlord, maybe even Mr. Lawrence, demanding to know what had happened. I pictured their faces when they realized the flow of money had stopped, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. The drive home was long, but I didn't turn on the radio. I wanted silence, the honest kind, without anyone's voice filling it. I passed the park where Daniel used to play as a boy. I remembered how he'd once tripped and scraped his knee, and how he had cried until I kissed the wound better. The memory used to make me ache with nostalgia. Now it felt like a distant story about someone else's child, a boy I once knew before he learned that love could be measured in dollars. When I arrived home, the phone was ringing again. I let it. I made coffee, sat at the table, and listened to it ring until it stopped. For the first time, I didn't rush to explain myself or make peace. I simply existed in that quiet space, drinking coffee that tasted stronger than I remembered. 10 minutes later, the phone rang once more. I picked it up, not to answer, but to turn it off completely. The silence afterward was beautiful, clean, steady, unbroken. I looked around the house. Everything was exactly as it had been the day before, but somehow it felt different. Maybe because I knew that from now on, I could decide who crossed the threshold, who took my time, my attention, my care. I had thought money was the only thing they had taken from me, but I realized they had taken something greater, my boundaries, and now I had them back. That afternoon, I went for a walk. I didn't bring my phone. I didn't even have a destination. I walked past the little bakery Robert used to love, past the old oak tree on Maple Street that still bore the initials we'd carved when we were young. I felt the sun on my face, the wind in my hair, the pulse of my own steps. I thought about all the times I had rushed to the bank, to the post office, to the grocery store, not for myself, but for them. Every errand had been a small act of erasure, but this walk was different. It had no purpose other than to remind me that I was still here, that my legs could move for me, not for anyone else. When I came home, I stood at the doorway and smiled. The house felt lighter. It wasn't haunted by the weight of unspoken expectations anymore. It was mine, quiet, still, and fully mine. That evening, I sat down and wrote in my notebook, "Today I reclaimed my life." The handwriting wavered slightly, but the words were steady. For years, I had believed that love required sacrifice, that motherhood meant endless giving, but standing there in my own living room, surrounded by the gentle hum of a house finally at peace, I understood something simple but profound. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for others and for yourself is to stop being their rescuer. And as night settled over the quiet street outside, I felt for the first time in decades a sense of safety that had nothing to do with locks or alarms. It came from within. When I arrived home that afternoon, a strange quietness settled over the house, the kind that usually means something is about to break. I remember setting my purse on the counter, taking off my coat, and noticing the faint smell of unfamiliar cologne. The curtains were drawn, but there was light movement inside the living room. My heart began to beat faster, a cold pulse under my ribs. I stepped closer and saw, through the half-open doorway, 3 figures: my son Daniel, his wife Sophie, and a man I didn't recognize. They were sitting at my table covered in papers I hadn't left there. Daniel's head was buried in his hands. Sophie was pacing, whispering sharply. The stranger, dressed in a gray suit, was calmly sorting through my documents as though he owned them. For a moment, I stood frozen, listening to the sound of my own breathing, feeling the floor tilt beneath me. Then I opened the door. "What is going on here?" My voice came out steadier than I expected, though I could feel the tremor under it. All 3 of them turned toward me, startled. For an instant, no one spoke. Then Sophie smiled, that smooth, artificial smile that never reached her eyes. "Eleanor, thank goodness you're here. We were just talking about you." "I can see that," I said, "and about my private papers, apparently." The man in the gray suit rose, extending his hand as though we were meeting at a business luncheon. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Mr. Franklin. I'm a family attorney. Your children have asked me to come by because they're concerned about your well-being." "My well-being?" I repeated slowly. "In what way?" Daniel finally looked up. His face was pale, eyes red-rimmed, like a child caught lying. "Mom, you've been acting differently. You canceled the bank transfers. You're not answering our calls. We're worried something might be wrong." I felt a cold clarity slide through me. "Something is wrong," I said. "You're in my house without permission, touching things that don't belong to you." Sophie stepped forward, her tone soft but rehearsed. "Eleanor, please, we're just trying to help. You've been under so much stress. Maybe the loneliness has been harder on you than you realize. We only want to make things easier." Loneliness. That word hit me harder than any accusation. How clever of her to use it, how cruel. For years they had treated me like an open wallet, but now they spoke as if they were the caretakers, as if my independence were a symptom of decline. Mr. Franklin gestured toward the papers. Your son and daughter-in-law are worried that you might not be in the best state to handle your finances. They've asked me to prepare a temporary power of attorney. It's just to help you manage things until you're feeling better. I walked past him, past Sophie's fake sympathy, past Daniel's lowered eyes, and gathered my documents from the table. My hands didn't shake. These are my private papers, I said quietly. And none of you have the right to be here, let alone to go through them. Daniel stood, his voice rising. Mom, we're only trying to protect you. You're not thinking straight. You can't just cut us off like this. You've always helped us. It's not like you. It's exactly like me, I said, turning to face him. It's just a version of me you've never met, the one who remembers she has the right to say no. Sophie tried to reach for my hand. Eleanor, sweetie, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We love you. Her touch made my skin crawl. You love my money, I replied, and I saw the mask slip from her face just for a second. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Hayes, I understand this feels confrontational, but your children have legal options if your decisions are putting you at risk. They can petition for guardianship if it becomes necessary. Guardianship. The word echoed in my ears like a threat. I laughed softly, though it wasn't amusement, it was disbelief. So this is what you came for, I said. Not to check on me, not to apologize. You came to take control of what's left of my life. Sophie's eyes filled with crocodile tears. That's not fair, Eleanor. We just want to help you. Everything you have will be ours one day anyway. We're only trying to manage it responsibly now. There it was, the truth, naked and ugly. They already saw me as gone. In their minds, my existence was merely a delay between their desires and their inheritance. I took a deep breath, the kind that pulls up strength from somewhere deeper than anger. Get out of my house, I said. Daniel looked stunned. Mom. Out. He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought I saw guilt in his eyes. But then it vanished, replaced by something colder, fear of losing control. You can't do this. You're making a mistake. Maybe, I said, but it's my mistake to make. Mr. Franklin gathered his briefcase, looking slightly embarrassed. Mrs. Hayes, I'll advise your family on next steps. I'm sure you will, I said, walking to the front door and opening it wide. Those next steps should start with walking out of mine. Sophie's tears stopped the moment the cold air hit her face. She looked furious now, stripped of her performance. You'll regret this, Eleanor, she hissed. You can't just cut people off like that. I met her glare without flinching. Watch me. They left with the wounded dignity of people unaccustomed to being told no. The moment the door shut, I stood still for several seconds, listening to the quiet that followed the sound of my own breathing, the faint ticking of the old clock, the pulse of blood in my ears. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt safe. Then, unexpectedly, I began to laugh. It wasn't the laughter of joy, but of disbelief, of exhaustion, of finally seeing the absurdity of it all. I had spent years terrified of being alone, and yet here I was, discovering that solitude was kinder than manipulation. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the streetlights blur in the drizzle. I thought of Robert again, how steady he had been, how he'd always said, Ellie, don't let people mistake your kindness for weakness. I had ignored that advice for too long. By dawn, I made a decision. I would not be intimidated. I would find someone who knew how to fight this kind of battle the right way, with law, with proof, with dignity. I would protect what was mine, not just the money, but the part of myself they thought they could rewrite. When the first light crept into the room, I whispered into the stillness, You wanted a fight. Now you'll get one. And for the first time in years, I felt truly awake. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, my body heavy but my mind alert. The confrontation from the day before still echoed through the rooms. I could almost see the outline of where they had sat, the coffee rings on the table, the scattered papers they had tried to claim as their own. It was strange how a home could hold both love and violation in its walls. For years, that house had been my refuge, but now it felt like evidence. Every drawer, every file, every faded receipt whispered a story of giving that had gone too far. I decided that if they wanted a battle, they would not find me unprepared. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting in the office of Samuel Beck, the lawyer who had helped me manage Robert's estate after he died. His office still smelled faintly of old wood and polished leather, a scent that carried the comfort of order. Mr. Beck was in his late 60s, his hair silver but his posture sharp. When he saw me standing at the door with a folder pressed to my chest, he didn't greet me with the polite indifference of a professional visit. He stood up immediately, concern etched in his face. "Mrs. Hayes," he said softly, "you look troubled. Sit down and tell me what happened." I did. Slowly at first, then faster, as though once I began, the words had waited too long to be spoken. I told him about the canceled transfers, the wedding I hadn't been invited to, the accusations of confusion, the lawyer at my table with the word guardianship on his tongue. He didn't interrupt. He only nodded, occasionally making notes in the margin of a legal pad. When I finished, my voice was shaking. "They want to take my life from me, Mr. Beck. Not just my money, my choices, my freedom." He leaned back, folded his hands, and said in that calm, measured tone that only men like him seem to master, "What you're describing is elder financial abuse. It's more common than people realize, and it almost always begins the same way with love used as leverage." I looked down at my hands, the fingers trembling slightly. I never thought my own son would be capable of something like this. "Love and dependency blur lines," he said gently. "You've spent years taking care of him. He learned that help was unconditional. People who are used to being rescued don't easily accept boundaries." He paused. "But you're not powerless, Mrs. Hayes. We can build protection. We'll document everything." We spent the next 2 hours going through my records. Every check stub, every receipt, every transfer. I hadn't realized how thorough I'd been over the years, how my habit of saving every slip of paper had now become my strongest defense. Mr. Beck organized them in piles, labeling each with sticky notes: rent, groceries, repairs, medical. "You've already done half my work for me," he said with a small smile. "Now we'll make it legal armor." He outlined a plan. I would change the locks immediately, install security cameras, transfer my savings to a new account at another bank, and draft an updated will. He also suggested an independent psychiatric evaluation to confirm my cognitive health, in case Daniel and Sophie tried to argue otherwise. "We'll stay ahead of them," he said. "They can't weaponize your love if you refuse to play the victim." As he spoke, something stirred in me, a mix of fear and relief. For years, I had carried the quiet dread that standing up for myself would mean losing my son forever. But sitting in that office, hearing my own story told back to me in legal language, I realized something important. I had already lost him. Not through anger, but through entitlement. The boy who once ran to me when thunder frightened him no longer existed. In his place was a man who saw my existence as an inconvenience and my generosity as a resource. I signed the papers, Mr. Beck, prepared with steady hands. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity. When I stood to leave, he walked me to the door. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "don't underestimate what you're doing. Most people never take this step. You're not just protecting yourself, you're teaching them a lesson they've refused to learn, that a mother's love is not a contract." Outside, the morning had turned bright, the sunlight sharp enough to make me squint. I drove straight to the locksmith. A young man named Ethan met me at the counter. He was cheerful, chatty, the kind of person whose optimism felt genuine. When I explained what I needed, his smile softened into quiet understanding. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll make sure no one gets in who doesn't belong." As he worked, I stood by the door, listening to the clicks and metallic turns of the new locks. The sound was comforting, final. When he finished, I paid him and said, "You've done more than you realize." He grinned. "Ma'am, that's what locks are for, peace of mind." Later, I stopped by a small security shop owned by Mr. Peters, an old neighbor. He and his son helped install cameras around the house. While they worked, I brewed coffee for them in the kitchen, and we talked about simple things: the weather, his wife's garden, the price of gas. It felt good, ordinary, safe. When they left, I walked through each room, testing the locks, watching the little red lights of the cameras blink. The house no longer felt invaded. It felt guarded. That evening, I treated myself to something I hadn't done in years. A visit to the salon. My stylist, Linda, nearly dropped her comb when she saw me walk in. "Eleanor Hayes, is that really you? It's been ages," she exclaimed. As she washed my hair, we talked not about Daniel or Sophie, but about me. About books, travel, the art classes I'd once wanted to take. When she finished, she turned the chair toward the mirror. My reflection surprised me. My eyes looked clearer. My face, though older, carried a lightness I hadn't seen in years. "You look radiant," Linda said. "What's your secret?" "I finally remembered who I am," I said softly. When I returned home that night, I found the quiet waiting for me again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was comforting. I made tea, sat by the window, and wrote in my notebook a habit that had become my therapy. I wrote, "Today, I stopped reacting. Today, I began rebuilding." Outside, the world was still the streetlights glowing faintly, a dog barking in the distance. I thought of all the women I'd met through the years, friends and neighbors who had spent their lives giving, explaining, apologizing. Maybe we were all guilty of confusing kindness with surrender. But not anymore. That night, I locked the door, double-checked the new bolts, and felt a quiet pride settle over me. I didn't know what the next day would bring: more calls, more manipulation, maybe even another threat. But I knew this: whatever they tried next, I was ready. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night without fear. Days passed in uneasy quiet. The house was secure, the locks new, the cameras blinking like silent guardians. But peace, I soon learned, was not something my son or his wife could allow me to have. The first call came on a Thursday afternoon, just as I was tending to my garden. My hands were in the soil, the air cool and earthy, when the phone began to ring. I almost didn't answer, but the sound was insistent, relentless, like a knock on a locked door that refused to be ignored. When I picked up, Sophie's voice greeted me, sugar-coated and fragile. "Eleanor, I've been meaning to call. We're having a little dinner this weekend. Just family, a chance to talk." I could hear Daniel in the background whispering something she thought I couldn't make out. "Tell her we'll make peace. She'll come if she thinks it's about family." The manipulation was almost clumsy in its transparency. I let her finish her practiced invitation, and when she paused, waiting for my answer, I said quietly, "How much do you owe this time?" There was a long silence on the other end, followed by a soft, nervous laugh. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, "I've known you long enough to recognize when your kindness comes with a price tag, so tell me, what's the bill this time?" Her voice hardened. "Eleanor, that's not fair." "No," I said, "it's honest." And I hung up. That night, I noticed a car parked across the street with its lights off. It stayed for hours. When I finally stepped out onto the porch, the engine started, and the car rolled slowly away. I knew whose it was. I didn't call the police. I simply wrote down the time and the plate number in my notebook, just as Mr. Beck had told me to do. The next few days were filled with small acts of intrusion. Anonymous calls that hung up when I answered. A knock at midnight that vanished before I reached the door. A neighbor, Mrs. Brooks, later told me she'd seen Sophie standing by my fence, pretending to check her phone. It was like being haunted by the living, watched, measured, tested for weakness. On Monday, I found an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a typed letter, unsigned. "Concerned neighbors have reported strange behavior at your home. Please cooperate with social services for your own safety." The words were cold, bureaucratic, and terrifying in their implication. They wanted to make me look unstable. I called Mr. Beck immediately. He wasn't surprised. "They're trying to create a paper trail," he said. "To claim you're unfit, keep records, be calm. The truth favors those who don't panic." The next morning, there was a knock on the door, a polite, rhythmic one. When I opened it, a woman stood there holding a clipboard. Her tone was firm but not unkind. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Mrs. Grant from the Department of Family and Social Services. We received a report suggesting you may need assistance managing your home." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Assistance," I said. From the same people who want to take it away? She blinked, uncomfortable. I'm just here to make sure you're safe. I invited her in. I had nothing to hide. The house was spotless, the bills organized, the medication neatly labeled. As she walked through the rooms, I saw her confusion grow. When we reached the kitchen, she stopped and said, "You seem very capable, Mrs. Hayes. Would you mind telling me who filed this report?" "I could take a few guesses," I replied. She frowned and made a note. "This seems personal. I'll close the case after I file my report. I'm sorry you had to deal with this." When she left, I called Mr. Beck again. He chuckled softly when I told him. "You handled it perfectly," he said. "Every false claim they make will backfire. Keep everything documented." That evening, I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker. The car returned different color, same posture, engine idling in the dark. They were desperate now. I almost pitied them. Later, I received another call, this time from Daniel himself. His voice was tense, not angry, wounded perhaps, but not in the way a son should sound. "Mom," he said, "why are you doing this? We're your family. You can't just shut us out." "I didn't shut you out," I said quietly. "You locked yourself out." "You're not being reasonable," he snapped. "Sophie said you've been acting paranoid. People are worried about you." "I'm glad they're worried," I said. "It means they're watching, and when they watch, they leave evidence." "Mom," he said after a long pause, "we just want to help you." "Help me?" I repeated. "By stealing my papers? By sending fake reports? By parking outside my house at midnight?" He didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed, a long, defeated breath. "You've changed." "Yes," I said, "I have, and you should pray I never change back." He hung up. I didn't cry this time. The grief that used to crush me had turned into something cleaner, sharper resolve. 2 days later, Mrs. Brooks came by with cookies and concern. "I saw someone at your mailbox last night," she whispered. "It wasn't the mailman." I smiled faintly. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said. "Don't worry, they're trying to rattle me." She nodded, her wrinkled hand resting briefly on mine. "If they come again, I'll call the police myself." Her kindness grounded me. Not all bonds are blood. Some are built on decency, on quiet loyalty. That night, I reviewed the footage from my new cameras. I watched Sophie's silhouette outside, pacing in the driveway, whispering into her phone. When the motion light flicked on, she ran. I saved the clip to a USB drive and placed it in a folder marked Evidence. By now, I wasn't frightened. I was collecting proof. Every call, every car, every letter, they were writing the story of their own downfall. On Friday, I received a letter from Mr. Beck confirming the restraining order was filed. It wouldn't stop them entirely, but it would draw a line they could no longer pretend didn't exist. That evening, I sat in my armchair, tea cooling beside me, and looked around at the house I had once thought of as lonely. Now it felt like a fortress, not because of the locks or cameras, but because I had learned to defend it. I realized something profound in that moment. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits quietly and refuses to open the door. Outside, the street was still, the car gone. The silence returned, not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that feels earned. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one waiting for them to call. I was the one they feared would answer. 3 weeks after the incident with the social worker, I woke to a quiet morning that almost felt like peace. The sunlight slanted across my living room, touching the framed photographs that now felt like relics of another life, smiling faces that had belonged to people who no longer existed. I made coffee, as I did every morning, and sat at the table with the newspaper. It was the kind of calm that only comes after a storm, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe it might last. But life, I've learned, doesn't let peace linger long when greed still breathes in the dark. That afternoon, Mr. Beck called. His tone was grave. "Eleanor," he said, "I need you to come by the office today. There's been a development." The word development sent a chill through me. I drove there with my heart thudding against my ribs, half expecting to see Daniel and Sophie waiting outside, smug with whatever new cruelty they had devised. When I arrived, Mr. Beck gestured for me to sit. His hands were folded on the desk, his expression tight. "They filed a lawsuit," he said, "a formal petition for mental incompetence." The words didn't make sense at first. They hung in the air like smoke, thick and unreal. "They want a judge to declare me incapable?" "Yes," he said. "If they succeed, the court could assign them as your legal guardians. That would give them full control of your finances and property." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was annihilation. They weren't trying to hurt my feelings. They were trying to erase my personhood, to turn me into an object that could be owned, managed, and silenced. "What evidence could they possibly have?" I asked. Mr. Beck slid a folder across the desk. "Fabricated," he said, "but convincing on the surface. Statements from supposed witnesses, claims about erratic behavior, even a letter from your pharmacist suggesting you've neglected your medications." "My pharmacist?" I said, incredulous. "I only buy vitamins." He nodded. "Then we'll prove it." That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the house settling in the cool night air. I thought about how far my son had fallen, how someone I once cradled in my arms now wanted to strip me of everything that made me a person. There's a special kind of grief reserved for parents who realize their children have chosen to become strangers. The next morning, Mr. Beck and I visited the pharmacy. Mr. Green, the pharmacist, turned pale when he saw me. He stammered, "Mrs. Hayes, I didn't mean any harm. Your daughter-in-law said it was for insurance records. I didn't know what it was really for." "Then you'll help me set it right," I said. And he did. He signed a statement clarifying that I had no prescribed medication and that his prior note was written under false pretenses. I thanked him quietly. When we left, I could see the shame etched on his face. From there, we went to speak with my neighbor, Mr. Davis, who had also given a statement. He was less cooperative. "You have been acting strange," he said defensively. "Installing cameras, yelling at your family in the street, people talk." I looked him squarely in the eye. "Would you install cameras if your son broke into your house? Would you raise your voice if you were being threatened by your own child?" He had no answer, just the hollow indignation of someone caught choosing gossip over truth. That night, Mr. Beck and I reviewed everything. "We'll need an independent psychiatric evaluation," he said. "We can't rely on their claims. I have a colleague, Dr. Moore. She's one of the best. She'll see you tomorrow." The evaluation took 2 hours. Dr. Moore was calm, intelligent, and kind. She asked me questions about memory, reasoning, finances, daily habits. I answered each one carefully, methodically, determined to show that every thread of my mind was intact. When she finished, she smiled. "Mrs. Hayes, you're sharper than most 50-year-olds I know," she said. "I'll prepare my report immediately." I should have felt relief, but all I felt was exhaustion. This wasn't just a legal case, it was a war against the erosion of identity. Every paper signed, every statement corrected, every word defended was a piece of my humanity clawed back from people who once called me Mom. Over the following days, my friends rallied around me. Mrs. Brooks from next door brought food and company, refusing to let me isolate myself. "You're not alone in this," she said, squeezing my hand. "They want to break you down, but you've already won half the battle by refusing to be silent." Cynthia, my hairstylist, came by one afternoon with a small group of her friends, women from her church, women who had faced similar betrayals. They listened as I told my story, and by the end, 2 of them were in tears. "I went through the same thing," one said softly. "My son tried to declare me unfit when I refused to sell my house. I fought back and I won." Hearing their words gave me strength. I wasn't the only one. This wasn't just my story, it was the story of countless parents who had been told that love meant surrender. A few days later, Daniel and Sophie showed up outside my house again, ignoring the restraining order. I saw them through the camera feed, Daniel pacing, Sophie on the phone, probably talking to their lawyer. My chest tightened, but I didn't open the door. Instead, I called the police. When the patrol car arrived, I watched from the window as they were told to leave. Daniel shouted something I couldn't hear before driving off, tires screeching. After they were gone, I walked outside and stood in the middle of the driveway, feeling the wind brush through my hair. It wasn't triumph I felt, but clarity. They had crossed the line from manipulation into madness, and I would no longer meet them there. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat in the garden with Mrs. Brooks. She poured me a cup of tea and said, "You know, I think there's a kind of freedom in reaching the point where you stop trying to make sense of people's cruelty. You just accept it, name it for what it is, and move forward." I nodded. "That's what I'm trying to do," I said, "to move forward without dragging the pain behind me." "Then you're already healing," she said. We sat in silence after that, watching the sky turn violet. The air was cool, fragrant with the scent of the roses I'd planted years ago for Daniel's birthdays. I thought about how those roses had bloomed year after year, no matter the neglect, no matter the storms. Maybe I could learn something from them to grow again, not in spite of the wounds, but because of them. The next morning, Mr. Beck called. "Dr. Moore's report is in," he said. "It's excellent, clear, thorough, impossible to dispute. You're ready for court." I hung up the phone and stood at the window, the morning light spilling across my floor. I didn't feel afraid anymore. What they had done was cruel, yes, but it had also given me something unexpected: purpose. For the first time in years, I wasn't living for someone else's comfort. I was fighting for my own dignity. And I intended to win. The morning of the trial arrived cold and gray, the kind of day when the air itself feels heavy, as though the world is holding its breath. I had barely slept. Every hour of the night had been spent in restless silence, listening to the ticking of the clock, wondering how it had come to this, how a mother could find herself standing before a judge, forced to prove that she still possessed her mind, her worth, her right to exist freely. When dawn finally crept in through the curtains, I rose without hesitation. I dressed carefully, choosing my black suit, the same one I had worn to Robert's funeral years before. It had once marked the end of a chapter. Now, it would mark the beginning of my fight to reclaim my life. When Mr. Beck arrived, he found me already waiting by the door, my papers neatly stacked in a folder. "You're ready," he said quietly. "I've been ready for years," I replied. The courthouse loomed over us, an austere building of stone and glass, indifferent to the lives it measured and judged within. Inside, the hallway was lined with cold metal benches, the air thick with the smell of old paper and nervous sweat. As we walked toward the courtroom, I saw them, Daniel and Sophie, standing with their lawyer. My son looked smaller than I remembered, his posture tight, his jaw clenched. Sophie, on the other hand, looked as composed as ever, her black dress immaculate, her expression practiced. When her eyes met mine, she smiled, a thin, brittle thing that didn't reach her eyes. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The silence between us had already said everything. When the bailiff called the room to order, I took my seat beside Mr. Beck. Judge Miller, a man in his late 50s with kind eyes but a firm voice, entered the room and began the proceedings. I kept my hands folded on the table, forcing myself to breathe evenly as their lawyer stood to deliver his opening statement. He spoke of concern, of love, of duty, how Daniel and Sophie only wished to protect me from my own declining judgment. He described me as isolated, paranoid, financially reckless. Each word struck like a small, deliberate blow. I glanced at Daniel. He couldn't meet my eyes. Sophie, however, watched me with the calm confidence of a person who believes they've already won. When the lawyer finished, Mr. Beck rose. His voice was quiet but sharp as a blade. "Your Honor," he began, "this is not the case of an elderly woman losing her grasp on reality. This is the case of a woman reclaiming her autonomy after years of exploitation. The plaintiff's claim of mental incompetence is not based on medical evidence but on frustration, the frustration of losing access to her finances." He laid the first piece of evidence on the table, my bank statements, each marked with years of consistent, rational transactions. "Mrs. Hayes has managed her finances flawlessly for over 4 decades, he said. "Every payment, every transfer is documented. The only erratic behavior here is that she finally decided to stop paying for her son and daughter-in-law's lifestyle." Then came the witnesses. Sophie went first. She walked to the stand, took the oath, and began to cry almost immediately. "Eleanor has changed," she said in a trembling voice. "She's angry all the time. She won't answer our calls. She accuses us of stealing when all we've ever done is care for her. We're terrified she'll end up alone, confused, taken advantage of by strangers." Her tears glistened, but her words felt hollow, rehearsed. When Mr. Beck began his cross-examination, her composure wavered. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his tone deceptively gentle, "is it true that you and your husband were married last year without inviting Mrs. Hayes?" "It was a small ceremony," she said, eyes darting. "Yet you invited your own parents, siblings, and friends?" "It was different." "Different how? Different because she wasn't a special person?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sophie's face flushed. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. Mr. Beck nodded. "Of course not, but it does seem that your definition of love shifts conveniently with your access to her bank account." The next witness was Daniel. My heart ached as he took the stand. He looked older than his years, tired, but there was still a stubborn defiance in his posture. "My mother's always been generous," he said, "but lately she's been unstable. She cuts people off for no reason, installs cameras, changes locks, refuses to see anyone. That's not normal." Mr. Beck waited until he was done, then stood. "Mr. Hayes, how old are you?" 35. "And in those 35 years, has your mother ever failed to pay a bill, file her taxes, or manage her home?" "No." "Would you say she's been dependable?" "Yes, but..." "Would you also say she's been generous?" "Yes." "So, if I understand correctly," Mr. Beck said, "she is organized, responsible, and generous. And when she decided to stop giving you money, you concluded she must be mentally ill?" Daniel's face tightened. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it?" He didn't answer. He looked down, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. When their final witness, Mr. Davis, my bitter neighbor, testified, his words were vague and easily dismantled. He spoke of odd behavior and visitors at strange hours, but under questioning, admitted he had never spoken to me directly about any concerns. Then it was our turn. Mr. Beck called Dr. Moore to the stand. She explained her credentials, her evaluation process, and her conclusion that I was not only mentally competent but cognitively exceptional for my age. She presented her report, charts, and test results, her professionalism impossible to discredit. Next came my pharmacist, Mr. Green, who confessed that he had been misled into signing a false statement. His honesty, humble and remorseful, carried more weight than any of Sophie's tears. Finally, it was my turn. As I walked to the stand, the courtroom seemed to fall away. My heart pounded, but my steps were steady. "Mrs. Hayes," Mr. Beck said, "why did you decide to stop supporting your son and his wife financially?" I looked at Daniel, then at Sophie, and finally at the judge. Because I realized that what they called love was nothing more than dependence dressed up as affection. Because I learned that kindness without boundaries is not love, it's servitude. I wanted to live the years I have left as a person, not as a purse. Judge Miller nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. When the opposing lawyer tried to rattle me during cross-examination, asking if I felt lonely, if I feared dying alone, I answered calmly, "I would rather be alone in peace than surrounded by people who see me as currency." After both sides presented their closing arguments, the judge took a recess to deliberate. The room buzzed with tension. Daniel wouldn't look at me. Sophie whispered furiously to their lawyer, her face tight with anger. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, silently praying not for victory but for truth. When Judge Miller returned, the room fell silent. His voice was firm, measured, but kind. "After reviewing all evidence," he said, "this court finds no indication that Mrs. Eleanor Hayes is mentally incompetent. Her financial decisions are consistent, logical, and within her rights. Furthermore, it appears this case was motivated by financial interest rather than concern. The petition for guardianship is denied." The words washed over me like sunlight after a long winter. I had won not out of vengeance but out of necessity. I had protected the only thing I had left, myself. As we left the courthouse, I didn't look back at Daniel or Sophie. Their voices called after me, but I kept walking. I stepped out into the crisp air, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders. Mr. Beck smiled softly. "You did it," he said. "No," I whispered. I finally stopped letting them do it to me. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. 3 months passed after the court verdict, and each morning I woke with a kind of astonished gratitude as though I had survived a storm that should have swallowed me whole. The silence in my house was no longer oppressive, it was cleansing. For the first time in years, I could hear the sound of my own life. No phone calls demanding money, no guilt disguised as love, no footsteps at my door that made my heart race with dread. Just the gentle rhythm of living, the whistle of the kettle, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the garden outside where the roses bloomed again. I had won. But victory, I soon realized, was not a destination, it was the beginning of another chapter. After the ruling, I sold my old house. It was not an easy decision. Every wall had a story, every corner a memory of Robert and the early years with Daniel. But the house also carried shadows, years of quiet exploitation, of loneliness wrapped in the illusion of family. When I signed the papers at the realtor's office, I didn't cry. I felt lighter. I used to think freedom meant staying rooted, protecting what you had built. Now I knew that sometimes freedom meant walking away. I bought a small apartment near the city center, a place filled with light, with tall windows that opened to the sound of birds and the laughter of children in the nearby park. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. The first night there, I stood on the balcony, a cup of tea in my hands, and watched the city lights shimmer below. I whispered to Robert, as I had so many times in the past year, "You'd be proud of me, love." I finally stopped waiting for them to come home. I kept my promise to myself and to Mr. Beck. Half of my savings went to organizations that protect the elderly from abuse, legal aid groups, shelters, advocacy programs. I met women who had endured far worse than I had, mothers forced out of their homes, widows tricked into signing away their pensions, grandmothers isolated and silenced. I listened to their stories, and I recognized pieces of my own in every one of them. What I had lost in family, I found again in purpose. The other half of my money I used to live, not survive, but live. I traveled through Europe, visiting places Robert and I had dreamed of but never seen, the canals of Venice, the lavender fields of Provence, the museums of Vienna. I walked along cobbled streets, eating gelato and watching the world move without needing to hurry. In every cathedral and garden, I found small reminders that life could begin again, even after betrayal. Sometimes, in the quiet of a foreign hotel room, I thought of Daniel. I wondered whether he ever thought of me not as the bank that funded his comfort, but as the woman who had carried him, who had given him everything until there was almost nothing left. I didn't wish him harm. I had already punished him in the one way that mattered, by removing myself from his reach. There is no harsher lesson for the entitled than the absence of the person who always said yes. Mr. Beck called one afternoon to tell me that Daniel and Sophie had moved out of their expensive rental. Their cars had been repossessed, their credit ruined. Sophie had taken a job at a small boutique, and Daniel was working construction again, the job he once said was beneath him. For a moment, I felt pity. But pity, I reminded myself, is not the same as love. Sometimes it is only the echo of old wounds that haven't yet faded. I continued to meet regularly with my new circle of friends, women I had met through Mrs. Brooks's garden club. We met every Sunday afternoon at a cafe near the park. There was laughter, sometimes tears, but always warmth. We called ourselves the Second Bloom Society. It was a name born from a joke, Cynthia once said. We're like late-blooming flowers. They thought we were wilting, but look at us now. We all laughed, but deep down, it felt true. None of us had been destroyed by betrayal. We had been remade by it. One spring afternoon, we organized a charity event at the community center for elderly women facing financial abuse. I spoke on stage, my hands trembling slightly as I faced the crowd. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," I began. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over. I believed love meant giving until there was nothing left. But love without respect is a cage. And the key to that cage is a single word: no. No to manipulation. No to fear. No to the idea that growing old means becoming invisible. When I finished, the applause filled the room like a wave. I realized then that every painful step of my journey had led me to this moment to speak, to help, to remind others that dignity has no expiration date. That evening, as I walked home under a sky streaked with violet, I stopped by the cemetery to visit Robert's grave. I knelt beside it and traced his name with my fingers. "You were right," I whispered. "Kindness is not weakness, it just needs to be guarded." The breeze stirred the leaves, and for a brief moment, I imagined him smiling. In the months that followed, my days settled into a gentle rhythm. Mornings spent painting by the window, afternoons volunteering at the advocacy office, evenings sharing dinner with friends. I laughed more than I had in decades. The weight of guilt and obligation had fallen away, replaced by something light, steady, and rare peace. Sometimes, I still received letters addressed to Mrs. Hayes from people who had heard my story through the charity. Some were from women thanking me, others from men ashamed of how they had treated their mothers. I read each one slowly, carefully, understanding that pain, when spoken aloud, can become a bridge instead of a prison. One evening, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset burn gold over the rooftops. I thought about all that had happened, the deception, the humiliation, the courtrooms, the tears, and realized that even in the wreckage, something beautiful had grown. Not revenge, not triumph, but freedom. True freedom. It struck me then that we spend so much of our lives trying to be everything for others that we forget to be something for ourselves. I had spent 72 years giving pieces of my heart to people who saw them as currency. Now, every beat belonged only to me. If you had told me 2 years ago that losing everything would be the best thing that ever happened to me, I would have laughed. But it's true. Sometimes, you have to lose the wrong people to find the right version of yourself. As the light faded and the first stars appeared, I whispered into the dusk, "I'm home." Not the home I had built for others, the one I finally built for myself. In the end, Eleanor Hayes' story is not only about betrayal, it's about rediscovery. What began as a quiet humiliation, a mother excluded from her own son's life, became the crucible through which she was reborn. Her journey reminds us that love, when twisted by manipulation, can turn into a weapon. Yet even after years of silence, fear, and financial control, she found the courage to say the one word that changed everything: no. That word became her shield, her compass, and eventually her freedom. When she stood in that courtroom, Eleanor wasn't just defending her money, she was defending her right to exist as a person of worth and clarity. In doing so, she stood for every parent, every elder, every person who has ever been told that their kindness makes them weak. She proved that dignity can be reclaimed at any age, that no amount of betrayal can truly destroy someone who chooses self-respect over dependence. Her transformation from a mother begging to be loved to a woman living freely, purposefully, and joyfully shows us something universal. It's never too late to begin again. It's never too late to protect yourself. And it's never too late to find the strength you once gave away to others. Eleanor rebuilt her life not through revenge, but through clarity. She learned to separate love from obligation, generosity from sacrifice, and family from ownership. In her new life, she discovered something that money and affection could never buy: peace. The lesson is simple but profound. Boundaries are not barriers. They are acts of self-love. In a world where people often confuse selflessness with surrender, Eleanor's story is a quiet revolution. She teaches us that aging doesn't mean losing control. It means choosing wisely where to place your trust, your time, and your heart. Whether you're 70 or 30, you deserve relationships built on respect, not dependency. In your own life, remember that standing up for yourself doesn't mean rejecting others. It means recognizing that your worth isn't defined by what you give, but by who you are. Protect your peace, no matter who threatens it. Say no when you must, and never apologize for living your truth. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Do you believe that saying no can sometimes be the greatest act of love for yourself or for others? Please share your thoughts in the comments below so we can learn from one another's perspectives. And if Eleanor's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating meaningful stories that inspire and empower. Thank you for being part of this journey.